Hi there, good morning. Bright and early. I think we're quickly going to jump into it. First of all, again, thank you very much for coming for an early morning session on what I think is a public holiday, no? Today is a public holiday.
Labor Day.
Labor Day, no less. So here we are. Artistic labor, no less. I'm very proud today to introduce our second keynote from Charlene Rajendran, looking at difference and aesthetic agency. I'm just going to read a little bit of her bio, but please talk to her more on what she's done, what she's accomplished. But she basically calls herself a theatre educator, researcher, practitioner, working at the National Institute of Education at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. She researches issues of contemporary performance, identity, and culture in urban multicultural contexts, and develops arts-based dialogic pedagogies that draw on contextually based knowledges to deepen critical and aesthetic thinking. She has also been dramaturg in performance projects such as Both Sides Now with Drama Box, which you heard a bit from King Ruan yesterday, and Gitanjali, I Feel the Earth Move, with The Necessary Stage. So I won't hog the mic, I'll just hand it over to Charlene.
Thank you, Hao Nian, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. I want to thank the Australian Theatre Forum and OzAsia for making this happen, the National Arts Council Singapore, of course, and Centre 42. And Hao Nian, thank you for inviting me to do this. David, thank you as well, because they co-convened this conference. Because it gave me an opportunity to think about some things and write it down and then communicate them and hopefully then hear about them. So my experience of ADN has been one of learning and lots of good conversations, and once again, that continues to occur. So I thank everyone from yesterday, because much of what I'm going to say not only resonates, but overlaps and sometimes repeats, in fact, what was said yesterday. And this was prepared in advance. So it's assuring, actually, that that is the case rather than otherwise. And the PowerPoint slides that I'm going to use are like a parallel text. So sometimes you can just pay attention to them and not me, and sometimes you can make links between them if you want and see how it goes. But make it work for you and just see how it works. So this work we do as dramaturgs, as dramaturgical thinkers, as people who take this idea of dramaturgy seriously and do something with it, similarly and differently, whether we fully understand it or not, this work we do is valuable, as it makes space for some critical enactments and provocative platforms that would not occur if not for this work. So I start with the declaration on Labor Day, no less, that dramaturgical work is critical and increasingly crucial. In a world that's becoming ignorant and indifferent to the discipline of digging into histories and not just accepting the hegemonic narratives fed to us, examining the politics of identity, and not simply using cultural categories to perpetuate identity wars, and rethinking notions of coexistence with all living species on a vulnerable planet, rather than pretending there is no problem to begin with. In short, dealing with difference. Hence, this work is not merely about the making of performance and aesthetic managing of performance texts, but the work of looking closely at the human condition, interrogating the socio-political practices that affect local and global expressions of this, and attending to the highly personal and cultural affects that lead to particular platforms, conventions, and practices of art making in all their multiplicity. Dramaturgical work is inextricably related to artistic thinking and doing, in that it focuses on the ideas and practices that go into an artwork. This is its intrinsic value, paying attention to the relationships and interconnections that are needed in art and that potentially expand and critique how these ideas and practices can work. Simultaneously, prodding to see what else can be done to reconfigure these ideas and practices and how they are understood, experimented with, and performed in the artwork. It thus produces space and time for alternative responses to our world that stem from a commitment to questioning, researching, and collaborating through art. This is not a self-obsessed and market-driven process, but one that is responsible, courageous, civic conscious, and aesthetically alive. Hence, this artistic process is informed, I would suggest, by two key qualities. Firstly, developing imaginative provocations, which involves thinking symbolically, using metaphor and allegory, engaging with the play of fiction and reality about issues that are no less urgent and demand attention, so that the work of the imagination is understood as primary, not relegated to a secondary position after rationalist modes of thought that deny imaginative insights. Instead, the imagination is recognized as necessary for the creativity and innovation that are crucial to human survival, with the artistic process spearheading spaces for this to be nurtured and sharpened. Secondly, particularly in relation to performance, this artistic process entails making collaborative choices, which means listening to a range of views and generating dialogue about these opinions in relation to the focus, approach, form, and intention of the art, and then making decisions that draw from this interaction and cross-fertilization of opinion, where difference is not feared, but embraced with an appetite for interaction. An often agonistic space, using Chantal Mouffe, where there is disagreement and where the otherwise silenced voices are allocated more space to be heard. Hence, more often than in the real world, dissensus, as Rancière would have it, can occur. But if imaginative provocation and collaborative decision-making are to be given priority, skills are needed to facilitate and stir these processes, as they are often messy, uncertain, ambivalent, and unpredictable, arousing a certain amount of anxiety and insecurity when those involved are pushed to review their methods or their approaches, or when critical opinions clash and create disruption that threatens to undo working ties. The risks of things falling apart are always present, and thus managing the outcomes and dealing with the possible fractures is also part of dramaturging. People, as much as artwork, need to be looked after and built up. And I believe these skills are leadership skills, and I highlight three in particular. First, the dramaturg must be closely attentive to what is being created and actively present. This enhances the sense of value that a work has, such that the need to scrutinize detail and investigate motivations stem from the conviction that these add to the legitimacy of the work and its role in the larger workings of life. It's not just about being fussy, but locating what matters and why and how. Critical attention makes these links purposeful, and active presence put focus on these connections when they are articulated and become part of the artistic discourse. Which leads to the second skill, deep listening, in which ideas are heard in the discussion, the rehearsal floor, and on all the spaces in between. Listening with sensitivity to what is said, what is done, how this occurs, and discerning the sonority that is produced, using the whole body, to borrow from David. The dramaturg is largely silent, but adds a quality of apprehension and response that is meant to thicken and deepen the work. This silence is not flippant nor frivolous, but it does not dismiss play either, deep play, where the stakes are high and the ritualistic intensity of energy is palpable in the silence, is understood as part of a heightened atmosphere that is generated when something unpredictable yet crucial takes place. Something that stems from an experiment or an excavation, but which seeks to dig deeper into a truth that would otherwise be glossed over. And third, a political consciousness, a skill that the dramaturg acquires in relation to the work she does and the context she works in. This means understanding the power relations within the art project, as well as those that circulate in the community, society, nation, region. Histories and narratives of selves and others are crucial in this regard, and increasingly, the question of difference, be it racial, national, ethnic, religious, ideological, sexual, class, educational, professional, material, and so on, becomes pivotal in the workings of a cultural landscape. And dramaturgical thinking has to take it on with rigor and sensitivity, as the dramaturg is meant to raise difficult questions, probe the problematic decision, and affirm the radical choice where needed. So, Whether we call ourselves dramaturgs, advisors, curators, mediators, facilitators, companions, stirrers, pengganggu, the first ADN started with what do we call ourselves? What words do we use? Listeners, jokers. Whatever we call ourselves, we are involved in this work, and it has implications. Ones that I would like to examine in relation to 3 Singapore practitioners whose dramaturgical thinking has been potent in shaping a landscape, the Singapore performance landscape, even if they are not primarily known as dramaturgs, but as directors, writers, and public intellectuals. They are Koh Pao Kuhn, Ong Keng Sen, and Kok Heng Luan, one of whom is no longer with us and one of whom is in the room. As theatre practitioners and performance makers who've been actively present in the theatre and art scene, deep listeners of the social and aesthetic terrain, and politically conscious navigators of the cultural landscape, the choices they have made stem, I would say, from their dramaturgical thinking. I want to suggest that they're socio-cultural and political dramaturgs who've observed closely and studied the landscape of society, and then proceeded to make suggestions, ask questions, and provide provocations through the art they make and the spaces that they've produced for critical art and artists to grow. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, of course, as there are others who have also played an important part in the process. And I'm conscious, now that I live in Singapore, although I'm from Malaysia, that there are 3 ethnically Chinese men. And indulge me as a non-ethnically Chinese man with this selection, because there are others, and we can talk about them later. T. Sasitharan, Alvin Tan, Harish Sharma, Alvian Saad, who's here, Natalie Hennigan, Nyam Sulin, they're all doing work in this realm, but bear with me, okay? So if we look at the work of Pao Kun, Keng Sen, and Heng Luan, while varied when compared to each other, they're by no means alike, it is easy to observe that it has been highly interdisciplinary and intercultural, bearing in mind that both those terms are to be read as loose frames for dealing with difference rather than any kind of prescribed mode or style or form. Responding to the Singapore context, which is materially urban, technological, and affluent, culturally post-colonial, multiple, now global, politically conservative, singular, paternal, they have spent time reading this complex yet tiny space in relation to the production of culture and the arts, and recognize the importance of negotiating difference, not just because society is officially multicultural or the pace of change in Singapore is so intense, but because the kinds of change that occur, material and cultural, psychological and personal, demands response. This demands a capacity to work with shifting and fluid frames of reference, so that being able to work with the liquid modern, in Zygmunt Bauman's term, has been evident, and being skilled in difference, or campur, has been most valuable. Now, this word campur is a Malay word for mix, but it's used more regularly in a kind of local patois to mean all kinds of putting together that stems from coexistence that is porous and overlapping, without becoming a melting pot. We campur the way we speak, eat, dress, live, make art. And somehow this has a less, perhaps, formidable and more organic meaning than difference or hybridity. So I'm using it here, or playing with it here, to refer to the performative mix of spoken, sonic, movement, and visual languages in performance, and suggest that this is a Singapore-Malaysian, if not Malayan, version of difference. So for Pao Kun, Keng Sen, and Heng Luan, I think campur is potent, but unsettled. It remains deeply imbued with potential. It's challenging and thus important to make accessible, to bridge. It's an assemblage, a collage, a mashup, various other things that challenge the way culture and the arts is experienced and apprehended conventionally, singularly. This is conscious work that involves redistributing the sensible, to draw on Rancière again, in relation to how the arts is perceived and navigated, what is discussed, how it is experimented, making opportunities for revising notions of the arts and thus altering what is possible by including more options and capacities, which means incorporating more people in the discourse with more skill. In redistributing the sensible, or in Malayan terms, working with campur, they have taken on leadership capacities that have advanced the role of artists in society. Now, it would take much too long to go into the details and complexities of what each one has done. So I'm going to focus on one particular aspect for each, arguing that these choices have advanced aesthetic agency in the Singapore context. If agency is the capacity to act with independence, critical awareness, and a strong sense of potential to be explored, then aesthetic agency refers to the ability to do this in relation to artistic choices that propose their own notions of beauty and truth. I'm not referring to aesthetics in the German, specifically Kantian sense, where there is a reaching for an absolute or a sublime. Nor do I subscribe to Adorno's notion of agency as belonging to the work of art alone. I do refer to aesthetics as that realm that produces certain kinds of judgment and evaluation that stem from particular contexts, cultural, and the forms and styles that gain situated value or cultural capital because of histories and politics therein. So in a space like Singapore, owing to colonialism, nationalism, now capitalism, and more recently a certain kind of fundamentalism and other forms of imposed values, the notions and norms of beauty, good, true, value need to be questioned, revised, dismantled, reconfigured, or rejected even, in order to develop contextually grounded and contemporary modes of making and giving value to art. And in this respect, aesthetic agency, like social and political agency, demands work and cannot be assumed. Power relations are embedded in discourses and practices, and this work is about learning and unlearning. If the work of learning or unlearning is to grow new and alternative understanding, a shift towards more depth and skill, and a capacity to then wield alternative languages, vocabularies of thinking and doing, then learners or unlearners must think of themselves as active participants in the discourse. The dramaturg is often concerned with what is learnt. What else needs to be learnt? How and why this learning occurs. So I suggest that when Kuhn set up learning spaces for performance at the start of his career through to his final years, and was an educator alongside being writer and director, he was dramaturging a society where the opportunities to learn the arts were, and probably still are, very few and far between. He did not train to be an educator, but recognized that if people could not learn the arts in a disciplined and rigorous manner, then the landscape would remain depleted of the key nutrients needed for new work to grow. So in 1965, when Singapore became a nation, and Kuhn and his collaborator wife Goh Lay Kwan set up Singapore Performing Arts School, which later became Practice Performing Arts School and is now the Theatre Practice. This was a significant intervention in the ecosystem. It was a non-profit organization that taught theatre and dance at a time when there were barely any affordable spaces for children and adults to learn the arts. It is the longest-standing professional bilingual group in Singapore, making it a bold venture. When Kuhn and Lay Kwan took this on, it was not an iron rice bowl in the way that teaching the arts can sometimes be perceived nowadays. It was a very risky choice, nonetheless one that they felt was crucial to feed the work they believed needed to be done. They continued to make performance, but they invested in a space where learning was important to the making. Both had the advantage of training abroad. In fact, Kuhn was at NIDA in Sydney from 1963 to 1965, having come to Australia to work as a radio announcer and translator in Melbourne in 1959. Goh was also in Melbourne, training at the Victoria Ballet Guild, and she went on to become a principal dancer. So it was on this big island that they met. And then when they returned to their small island, they set up a domestic and artistic union. In fact, based on a website, so I haven't confirmed this with people yet, we're told that they got married on the 1st of July in 1965, and it was the same day they registered the Singapore Performing Arts School. Now, seeking to decolonize and make contextually based performance, their training in the West was adapted to the needs of a Singapore context. Instead of mimicking Western-based processes, in a post-colonial decolonizing context, it's important that they experimented with these systems and styles in relation to what people in the region were already performing. They drew from languages and vocabularies that were folk, traditional, and contemporary in what they encountered. And we can then make links between this process of thinking about the arts and the kinds of performances that Kuo especially went on to make later, such as Mama Looking for Her Cat in 1988. Now, this was a seminal multilingual performance that has since led, I would say, to the use of more than one language in Singapore becoming fairly ordinary. Theatre is still categorized according to language, and this impacts audience profiles who attend. These patterns can be linked to how people are schooled, how they're brought up, and so to unlearn is to make space where options are palpable and concrete. And so for Pao Kuhn, learning the arts entailed learning about how society breathes and dealing with difference as part of this space. Difference was never a barrier, but a possibility. And education was not geared towards standardizing cultural norms, but working with these multiplicities. And so his notion of open culture, in which one is rooted in a particular culture, not necessarily of one's prescribed ethnicity, and then open to a range of other cultures that then feed into an extension of oneself and an evolution of a larger culture, was his way of asserting an alternative to the official multicultural policy, which tends to be separate parallel cultures that coexist but don't intersect or cross into each other. This is still a struggle for the city-state, which still aims, and recently someone was commenting about a need for a perfect multiculturalism, but not a deep multiplicity that allows for fluid yet historically valued borderlines, even though everyday life is becoming increasingly campo. As cultural hybridity, or camporan perhaps, became more ordinary, and notions of local intercultural existence was accepted by people, even if not officially as part of a Singapore identity, local performances expressed this difference more regularly. And this affected how Pao Kuhn was thinking about culture, and I suggest he went on to set up the Theatre Training and Research Program in 2000, which is now the Intercultural Theatre Institute, which then meant a shift from looking at multiplicity of cultures within Singapore to more global perspectives that challenged notions of the contemporary performer. Bringing together traditional and contemporary practitioners to teach and learn, the approach underlined a need for an intercultural understanding that was more profound and politically aware of the power hierarchies and complexities of difference in performance. Here again, Pao Kuhn was offering an alternative to what is perhaps a Western-based interculturalism of simply staging performers and forms from different traditions and nations, and to then develop capacities for difference within bodies and not just between them. This school has had to contend with a range of issues just to stay alive, but nonetheless it remains and is a valuable site on which certain kinds of thinking and doing can occur. So Pao Kuhn is now a renowned pioneer theatre director and playwright whose work is part of the Singapore canon. And it may be difficult to remember sometimes that he was not always an established figure who enjoyed the benefits of sanction. Notions of transition, being at the margins, working from the edge, were very much part of how Pao Kuhn contributed to and contested the ways in which art was framed, positioned, and created in Singapore. This was political and it was personal. He was a very active presence who spoke out in relation to the fractures and frailties in the cultural landscape, sometimes at great cost, such as when he was detained without trial under the Internal Security Act for alleged communist activities from 1976 to 1980. And if you read his writings and speeches, now published in a collected edition of his works, you see that he spoke on education, economy, culture, identity, politics, the need for play. He was not just interested in art, but its relationship with everyday life, and in how it led to thinking about and feeling for people. And this came through time and time again. For Kuo, an underlying key principle in learning that is now often cited was better to have a worthy failure than a mediocre success. A dramaturgical principle for the arts in Singapore where everything tends to be laced with high stakes and high pressure burdens to be successful. Pao Kuhn founded the Substation in 1990, which remains an independent art space for experimental arts, where many artists have benefited from having a space in which they can try out new work with relatively low financial resources, but high morale support. His vision to make space for taking artistic risks and prodding critical engagement was exceptional. Many practitioners were nurtured and encouraged by him to keep doing so. His was a very active and attentive presence. Which leads me to the second sociocultural political dramaturg I want to talk about, Ong Keng Sen. As artistic director of theatre works since the late 1980s, Keng Sen is known for his spectacular intercultural, interdisciplinary performances, from Lear to more recently Trojan Women and a whole gamut of works in between and before. His leadership of theatre works has led him to program a wide range of performances that include the classics at one stage, but initially gave emphasis to new and local work that expressed a Singapore in transition, struggling with its own apprehension of change and difference. History, myth, memory, technology, land, politics, identity, precarity, ambivalence have been just some recurring themes in his oeuvre. All the while, experimenting and culling new approaches to thinking about and making performance in the Singaporean, Southeast Asian, then Asian, and now global context. Not unlike Pao Kuhn, Keng Sen recognizes the need for artists to have platforms to learn from each other and collaborate, so that notions of culture and nation would become more porous. The Flying Circus project is a key project that exemplifies this. This is how it's articulated on the TheatreWorks website, quote, "Established in 1996, the Flying Circus Project, or FCP, is a major program exploring creative expression in Asia. Its focal points are individual creative action, encountering difference and strategies of art practice, emphasizing the tenacity of local sites with their artists, activists, and public intellectuals. The FCP is curated around the central notion of world creating. How do we form new micro-worlds which are responsible, articulated, and ethically engaged?" End of quote. So apart from the artists coming together from various parts of the world, they are world creating, making new worlds, making new micro-worlds that then of course change the way the world is, aesthetic agency. The Flying Circus project was initially geared towards revitalizing artistic expression in Asia through juxtaposition in tradition. And engaging with traditional masters to start the ball rolling, the aim was to engage tradition as a living process rather than a museum piece. This notion of culture as active and fluid and changing. Performers, contemporary and traditional, came together to learn about and understand each other's work and then examine how there could be interactions, intersections across cultures and disciplines. In order to do this, there was a need to listen very deeply to what was happening and how practices and ideas needed to change. Also, as Keng Sen identifies, the political act of Asians coming together to ask questions about what was Asian was propelled by finding dialogue that he terms autonomous, empowering, and equitable. This laboratory, not production process, was meant to be eked out by everyone, a collaborative and imaginative vision, a vision that needed to be found rather than already decided in advance. And in a relatively early interview that Keng Sen did in Berlin in 1998 about the FCP, he acknowledged that this project was propelled by an interest in crossing borders and the cultural mix that exists within oneself, multiplicity within the body, his self to begin with, he explained. He talked about code switching as moving between different cultural sensibilities, part of an internal landscape that he has negotiated as someone who is Singaporean. So to counter a feeling of loss or displacement, the process was fueled by a validation of this mix, this champo, rather than a search for authenticity that is rooted in a single, clearly defined history. And this helps dismantle rigid borderlines of selves and others without denying their particularity or their situatedness. Instead, it develops a capacity to think through one's limitations and extend one's boundaries by embodying and enacting artistic processes in dialogue. It pushes for difference to act as catalyst to new aesthetic possibility, open culture with new options for choice. So responding to the changes and listening to what else was needed, the FCP, of course, has then changed, and it's no longer focused on Asia. Since 2004, European, American, Arab, and African artists are included. And from a laboratory, it has now included the setting up of alternative universities of daily life, Phnom Penh being the first one. Clearly, learning is a focus, unlearning, and experimenting is part of this politically pedagogical dimension. So more recently, Keng Sen's role as the founding artistic director of the Singapore International Festival of Arts from 2014 to 2017 has meant being responsible for a national platform of artistic meaning-making. Now, this festival has been highly regarded since its inception in 1977 and is exceptional for its breadth and depth in the Southeast Asian, if not Asian, context. And as one would expect, Keng Sen was an apt choice to take leadership of this festival and take it to a new level, as I believe he did. But I want to highlight a new aspect of the festival, the open, that speaks to how his dramaturgical sensibilities were working to intervene in the landscape. Earlier this year at ADN in Yokohama, Keng Sen spoke very clearly about how he saw his role as festival director as creating interventions, and this interview is available on the website, where he sought to create greater transparency and that his work included being like an ombudsman, a term he used, a term that suggests mediation between sites of conflict. He talked about the difficulties of making work when there is a prevalence of censorship, because this precludes the possibility of certain kinds of failure, echoing in some ways Kuhn's identification of the need for a worthy failure more than a mediocre success. And here the ombudsman opens up spaces for critical dialogue, and this becomes a form, in Keng Sen's words, of public office, where the capacity to comment on, work with, and cut into policies about the arts in Singapore, as well as capitalist tendencies about life as a whole, are part of the responsibility that a festival director takes on in his dramaturgy of the festival. So Keng Sen developed the Open, which is a pre-festival of ideas that gives focus to being open, participatory, engaged, and in negotiation, the acronym, rather than being concerned with the consumption of a festival, which tends to be about value for money and getting a good deal. Instead, the Open emphasizes exploration by raising questions and pushing for public engagement. Now, this occurs 2 months before the festival begins, and in the final iteration, it led straight into the festival proper. And the website suggests it's styled as a popular academy to, quote, build a certain type of consciousness and attitude to art where, quote, there is a belief system and a space for really asking questions, a kind of Camelot, end of quote. And this is Keng Sen speaking about it, where we gather around the table and we really talk. We use the image of the round table as a format, as we're doing here for conferencing and dialogue, but how far do we go in realizing the ideals of equity and justice when we do? Do we really have capacity for dissensus through Champo? Now, several discussions about the role of the festival director and the festival in the city have emerged since Keng Sen took on this position. And even as a new director takes over, the dialogue continues. They relate to funding, censorship, programming, etc. And perhaps this has been another dimension of the interventions or mediations that are not just related to a pre-festival of ideas like Open, but a post-festival of ideas as well, where the active presence, deep listening, and political consciousness of the ombudsman enables the landscape to begin to start doing some of these things and therefore continue its response and responsibility. Keng Sen's work, I think, can be read as advancing how the Singapore arts landscape becomes more mature, able to innovate with confidence, and create art that stirs deep. The trajectory of the Flying Circus project that moves then into the Open deepens the discourse while opening up options. This is a form of arts advocacy that underlines the importance of taking ownership and being participant, recognizing how public engagement and civic consciousness are key to the relationship of art makers and art audiences. Which leads me to the work and dramaturgical thinking of Kok Heng Luan, Artistic Director of Drama Box and currently nominated Member of Parliament for the Arts. Now, some of you who were here yesterday, I think most of you heard about Heng Luan's work from Heng Luan, so I'm not going to say as much and hope that he'll speak more and become part of this dialogue. Heng Luan has been acutely involved in the navigation of these spheres, public civic consciousness in art, as a writer and director, and sometimes production performance dramaturg as well. His artistic choices are informed by a deep sense of critical engagement with people who are often not regular theatre goers, and a concern for social justice and empowerment. He takes seriously the question of how to develop conversations with the public through the arts about issues that are potent in their everyday life and significantly in spaces that are within their lived environment. Hence, for the past 2 decades particularly, his work has spanned the conventional theatre space. It's reached out into the void deck, which is this space under high-rise public housing flats where people gather for a range of reasons, including weddings and funerals. The open-air field, a hospital foyer, and other sites that are non-conventional performance venues in order to get audiences involved in the conversations that he puts together. One outcome of this is that Drama Box now has 2 inflatable theatres called Goli that you saw yesterday, which are really unique in their presence and vision for performance in the community. Heng Luan's not avoided the difficult issues, using forum theatre, immersive and engaged arts processes to deal with tough topics and complex emotions. These range from death and dying, SARS epidemic, land acquisition, questions of racial identity, making the work of Drama Box a critical reference point for the state when it comes to seek dialogic arts processes about sensitive topics that many others might veer away from for fear of reproach and reprimand. So in 2012, Heng Luan steered an interdisciplinary engaged arts project called IPS Prism, collaborating with a think tank, this is IPS, Institute of Policy Studies, and a range of artists to look at issues of governance. This was an unprecedented moment in which this think tank worked with artists to think about public aspirations for the state and allowed for public conversations about government and governance through forum theatre and other interactive arts portals that were generally more edgy than usual, not blatantly oppositional, as the intent was to have dialogue with a range of parties, but much more imaginative and collaborative than otherwise generally associated with a think tank. And Heng Luan's work continues to advocate for political consciousness to be seeped into the fabric of art making in order to create, in his words, a diversified, creative, and sustainable future for Singapore, with wisdom and empathy. End of quote. Now, more recently, Heng Luan's become nominated Member of Parliament for the Arts, and this, of course, opens up new dimensions of leadership. In this capacity, he is not only engaging with arts policy, but making a concerted effort to position the arts as central to all of society. And he locates art as a way of thinking, not just a product, and challenges society and those in leadership particularly to do likewise. In order to reflect the views and needs of the arts community, he has engaged several town hall sessions, held consultation focus group discussions with artists, stakeholders, and audiences. And he continues to be engaged in advocacy through the kinds of artistic projects he helms, such as Both Sides Now. Now, Heng Luan has spoken up on a range of issues that include censorship and funding for the arts, as well as urban planning, the rights of women, the death penalty. Not because these are extraneous to the arts, but because these are concerns that artists take on and talk about in their work. He has expressed the view that art needs to be seen as important in order for it to be taken more seriously, and in order for the arts to become a higher priority. This is no easy task. It requires leadership for this to occur. So I would say that Heng Luan's dramaturgical thinking negotiates the arts as central to the advancement of society and encourages the public to be active in dialogue and participation towards this. His approach to why the arts is critical pertains to the capacity that the arts has for generating different modes of being that are needed in society. Difference, Campuran, is again a catalyst for an aesthetic agency that is propelled by political, social, and personal purpose, one that admits the tensions and difficulties of negotiating the cultural landscape, but builds on an imaginative and collaborative process for creating new options that empower greater agency and solidarity. In many respects, I think the arts NMP has to work through a dramaturgy of politics and performance, and then make choices about how to perform accordingly. In a world that's increasingly lacking good leadership across a range of sectors, not just politics, but in education, economics, culture, the environment, arts leadership that is informed by good dramaturgical thinking can assist. Imaginative and collaborative decision-making skills are needed, particularly in relation to issues of difference. And this is something artists take on when they critically develop and dramaturg a process, a performance, an arts landscape even. Especially when this includes an intercultural or interdisciplinary approach that foregrounds difference as a key working dimension in the artistic endeavor. Hence, by thinking about dramaturgy as interventions into the broader sociocultural and political space, the dramaturg takes on a deeper level of engagement with society, involvement with artists, and commitment to the art-making process as well. It's not merely about improving the quality of art making, but addressing the needs of an arts ecosystem as well. Perhaps initially through a performance or project, but gradually through an overall capacity to participate in and affect the way the arts is positioned and responded to more widely. In an edited volume of essays on the grammar of politics and performance, Shirin Rai and Janelle Reinelt investigate the relationship between politics and performance to discover structural similarities they call grammar, and argue that, quote, political thinkers need to consider a dramaturgical and performance analysis such that politics cannot be analyzed seriously without a sophisticated understanding of its performance, end of quote. Their interest in the conjunction of politics and performance is to suggest fresh approaches to a globalizing thrust of neoliberalism and look at the importance of identities, causes, and the namings of groups that affect how difference operates in society. As they state in their introduction, quote, this book is an attempt to engage in interdisciplinary dialogue that goes beyond the polite acknowledgement of academic efforts to think beyond our disciplinary paradigms and show a wide array of connections between and among vocabularies, concepts, and methods of approaching the topic, end of quote. And if we look further at the work of Kuhn, Keng Sen, and Heng Luan, and others like them, we could perhaps evolve a grammar of dramaturgy and leadership as well, in which principles of working in the arts are recognized as leadership qualities that advance aesthetic agency and deepen the discourse on the arts. This is arts leadership and aesthetic agency that I hope we can expand through the increased attention and participation in dramaturgical thinking in mini symposia such as this, and other platforms where we review our work as dramaturgs, or whatever we call ourselves, and strengthen the dramaturgical quality of the choices we make for change. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Shal. We have time for some discussion and some for Q&A. Yesterday, I think some of us observed that there was quite a bit of thinking that was happening in the room after each session. And I think some of the things that came out from the speakers were definitely rich, but sometimes dense, and it takes a bit of unpicking and unpacking. So I think for this session today, I'll also like to invite if there are any comments that could be linked to even yesterday's session. Of course, if you have comments and feedback and questions to Charlene, definitely we would like to hear. Is there, would anyone like to start us off from just observations? David.
That was just fantastic, and the reason why I think it was really fantastic is it's quite a there's something about the what you were saying which really resonated with me, and I think is very important when thinking about the agency of the artist, and that's the whole idea that artists, I think, have often been we're often quite antagonistic in our relationship to society and to government, and basically those three people that you've identified, they're all protagonists. And actually I think that's a role that, you know, artists need to take on much more to be a protagonist in that space. And those three artists, I met Kuhn just a few years before he passed away. He came to Melbourne, and he was always known as somebody who he was like a political dissident. You know, he was somebody who really took it upon themselves to resist very strongly, you know, the conditions of government under which he tried to make art. And in that way, his agency is international. I think King Sen, who, you know, with Flying Circus, it's almost, and I think it's really important for Australia to kind of note what he's doing with Flying Circus, because it's a post-decolonisation process. It actually, the language that he's developing and that he's developed is actually something that happens after the process of decolonisation, which is a very current kind of story that's going on in Australia at the moment. So actually for us, there's a kind of a future to look for in the work that he does because of the language that he uses. It's very inclusive. You know, it's very progressive. It's really forward-thinking. And, you know, Hengluan, where's he? So, you know, this is an incredible kind of, you know, agency which, you know, it's a perversity really about Singapore, I think, in that you actually have a nominated member of parliament for the arts. You know, I think it's really something to kind of, it takes a while to get your head around it, because actually Singapore's got a lot of restrictions, and we, you know, heard about that yesterday in some of the conversations. But to have this kind of proposition, there seems to be a sort of deep desire to find a way out of the contradictions simply by having a position like this, you know, in Parliament, which I think is something that, you know, we can really kind of think about in Australia, and, well, not just Australia, but actually more broadly. So I just wanted to kind of frame that in terms of what you were saying, actually. There's such a kind of an international agency about those three protagonists that really are quite particular to Singapore. But if we kind of unpack it and let ourselves, you know, be part of the unpacking process, there's so much that, you know, we can actually all learn from in that space. And I think that's a book. So,
Thanks, David.
But it was
Thanks.
a comment rather than
Thank you.
anything. So thank you. I was
That's
really.
a book.
I
That's
found
a
it-
comment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
David.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, very nicely
Thank you very much.
commented. Do you want to respond to that?
No, I think it's said it all.
Is there anyone else who would like to pitch in or even sort of hark back to yesterday's sessions? There is one thing that I think I just want to highlight a bit. We've used the word pengganggu. And Charlene and some of us mentioned yesterday the first iteration of the symposium, which we did in Singapore. Let me get this right again.
Last year.
Last year.
Just say last year.
Last year, it was exciting because a whole group of us came together to talk about just quite fundamental and basic things. What is a dramaturg? What is dramaturgy? From Indonesia, India, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, Philippines. And it was a rich discussion because then I sort of proposed the idea of, can we look at mother tongues, languages, different sorts of languages that came from all these countries, and how these local practitioners could perhaps actually have a dramaturg already, or could be practicing dramaturgy without these words. And pengganggu stuck with us. Pengganggu, Malay, Indonesian word, the root of it being disturber or interferer. And I thought it was created by our dear friend Heli Minati just to maybe explain someone's role as a dramaturg in her contemporary dance community in Indonesia. But further conversation with her revealed that no, that's the term they use for actually young choreographers working in student or institutions developing works, especially for their final year projects. There were two words that were used actually, pendamping and pengganggu. Pendamping is a little less insidious because the word pendamping literally means companion. But even with Heli's sense of humor, she said we all actually prefer pengganggu, the interlocutor, the disturber, simply because in the kinds of performance and traditions of cultural practices that we do, especially in Malaysia and Indonesia and of the Malay archipelago, there is always a lot of play in it, as in playfulness. And the pengganggu's role was as we've heard just now, from mediator to joker. And it's always, for me, I think what's been happening is that this pengganggu, when put alongside dramaturg, because there's also been a lot of notion of the dramaturg being invisible, right? That dramaturgy is invisible but inherent in the process, in the performance. I wonder if, I'd like to respond to that.
I think as you were talking just now, it struck me that the dramaturg emerges in a particular socio-cultural and political space. So the origins of a particular time and space in Europe, Germany, etc., where this word, this role emerges for certain reasons that I don't know about. I haven't looked into that, right? And therefore, when corresponding roles and functions and needs emerge, I guess, then one is the kind of word that we use to articulate that role, but the other is also how certain persons perhaps emerge before the words emerge, obviously, and then how we go about a certain kind of naming process in order to make sense of, but then more problematically try and define, limit, and curtail. So if we're just using these two words, pengganggu and pendamping, on a spectrum, and this is provoked by a question that Kathy asked me for the short interview on Arts Equator, because she said, dramaturg, gatekeeper, or doorway. I'm like, and I had 2 minutes to think about this question, right, just before this interview. Okay, 5 minutes. And it then came about that I thought about it as a spectrum rather than an either or. But then that produces one little space where one little metaphor becomes operative, right? And then a pengganggu, pendamping becomes another kind of operative. And then I remember Yinan from China had a very complex explanation of the consultant or something.
The advisor.
Right. Where there's a certain hierarchy in society that is being responded to. I mean, you compare very stereotypically China and Indonesia, then clearly in the Chinese context, the expectation of this hierarchy, which Anuradha Rao talked about last year. Anuradha Rao from India also talking about how, sometimes the hierarchy is reinforced very problematically by the dramaturg. And so it creates a very different kind of political process and function and role. And then compared to Indonesia and the kinds of people that I suppose we're talking to, Indonesia a little bit, also less hierarchical. And how this begins to percolate. So if I think about that in relation to Pao Kuhn and Keng Sen and Heng Duan, who have stemmed from very different spaces. I mean, so Pao Kuhn came and trained in NIDA, Keng Sen trained as a lawyer in Singapore, Heng Duan has a degree in mathematics. So, those are things that also generate all kinds of sensibilities. Yeah, that's, if we're thinking of a dramaturgical sensibility, that's not defined obviously by a grammar only, but by the person who's using that grammar and speaking that vocabulary, then it's going to be significantly different. And I'm not saying the names are not useful, but I think we need to remember this, because this is what's emerging when we are struggling with the word dramaturg, that it's been almost decontextualized and taken out and used. But what we're trying to do is imbue it with more context, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Again, just a bit of promotion for those of you who are interested actually in some of the discussions we've done in our past seminars. Charlene already said that if you go into our website, Asian Dramaturgs Network, most of the links are up already actually, and especially when I was talking about for some of you who are interested in etymology of dramaturgy from a different perspective, it wasn't only just Indonesia. I forgot Yinan also from China sort of gave her view of what a Chinese dramaturg or a Chinese dramaturgy is about. And then, of course, there is even from Kentucky Gucci, Japan, there is no Japanese word actually. So it's dramaturg, which is the Japanese version. It's literally a transliteration of the word. And he had to unpick it and how to then go on to that. So yeah, have a look.
And credit to Center 42. The recording is
Yes.
really well done. It's very listenable too and very watchable, because I did my homework before coming in. I hadn't watched the videos either. But it's that makes a big difference when you're watching videos online. The quality of sound really, really works, really helps.
Now, any other comments or questions from the floor? Right, I'm so glad that we do have quite a bit of time in terms of breaks. So I think I'm just going to call it here for now so that we have time to have coffee and then chats with each other. But please help me to thank Charlene again.
Thank you.